So last week we started our study in the New Testament, and we're talking in the context of end times through the New Testament prophets. We went through the Old Testament prophets, and remember when we started this, I said that to me, for us to fully understand end times, you need to start in the beginning. So we did, and we've gone through that. It was a long process to get through it. There was a lot of material to cover. But I hope that as we start covering that and as we start going through the New Testament Gospels and the prophecies of Jesus himself, that we can see how all of that leads to where we're ultimately going. And get to my right spot and we'll start. And we talked about Jesus being a prophet. And, you know, that's not what we think of first off, but he was a prophet. We identified what that means last week and how that fits in. But now what we're going to do is study the words of Jesus, and we're going to combine the synoptic gospels and cover what he said from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're going to read from Matthew, but you'll see highlighted areas in the other passages where you can look and see the same accounts or the same stories and the same events. I want you to remember as we start in this section, because there's a lot of events in Mark, Matthew, and in Luke that we're not going to cover. We're not going to talk about all the events that happen, but there's a few things that we need to keep in our mind as part of the context of where we are when we start. So John the Baptist had been beheaded. Jesus had fed the 5,000. He walked on water. He'd healed the sick. He'd gone into this big conversation with the Pharisees about tradition. He'd shown the Sadducees and the Pharisees all around him who he was. They saw miracles, yet they wanted a sign of things to come. They wanted to know, how can we know that what you say is true? It wasn't enough to see the things that he had already done, but they wanted something else and something more. So if someone would read Matthew chapter 16, verses 2 through 4 for us, please.
And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed.
All right, thank you. So in verses 1 through 4, the Sadducees and Pharisees asked for that sign. It said, then the Pharisees and Sadducees. So they're working together, showed a deep fear among religious leaders. If you remember, the Sadducees and the Pharisees were really long-standing political enemies. They didn't get along very well. The only time that they worked together was when they were working against a common enemy that they were looking at. They were very concerned with what Jesus was going to do to their political holdings and the things that they had. They weren't really getting, this is the Messiah. Not really get. They weren't getting that this was the Messiah that had come. They were looking at him as a threat to their power. The fact that they came together against Jesus really shows how serious a threat they thought he was. Let's take a real quick look at the primary differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees lived according to the smallest points of the oral and scribal law. They took everything that was there and lived by it to the T. They did not want to do certain things at certain times. They wouldn't walk more than so many steps on the side. I mean, everything, they took it so literally, and they were so obsessed with keeping that law. The Sadducees received only the written Hebrew, the words of the Hebrew scriptures. So they weren't quite as much a stickler on that law, that the not just what was in the Torah, but what their rabbis had come up with to help them get through that. The Sadducees didn't have that. The Pharisees believed in angels and the resurrection, and the Sadducees did not. Paul used that division in Acts 23 to his advantage to kind of get them to talking about the difference there that he had.
So Alan Murphy always said that they're sad, you see, because they don't believe in resurrection.
Yeah. I purposefully left that out. But thank you, Bruce. The Pharisees were not a political party and were prepared to live under any government that would allow them to practice their religion in peace and the way they wanted to. So it's like, we don't care who's in charge out there, just leave us alone. Okay. The Sadducees were aristocrats and collaborated with the Romans to keep their wealth and power. So where the Pharisees were like, just leave us alone. They're not working with them, just leave us alone. The Sadducees were actually working with them to help build their power. The Pharisees looked for and longed for the Messiah, but the Sadducees didn't. The Pharisees and Sadducees didn't walk in the same circles as they lived through life. Yes, they were in the temple. Yes, they did things in the same places, but as far as being together and being united in their faith, they were not. Yet for all of these differences, Jesus brought them together. Now, he didn't bring them together in the way that you might think, not in a way of worshiping the Messiah and being glad that he was there. It was really in opposition to Jesus that he brought them together. And then testing him, they asked him if he would show them a sign from heaven. And Jesus had done many signs. We talked about that. But they remained unconvinced. They wanted more. There's people, I see people on the internet, they're talking about their lack of belief, I guess. And they will tell you things. You'll hear them say, the only way I'll believe in Jesus is if he walks up to me and, does a miracle to me right in front of me. They're lying. That's what he had done here. They saw it. They saw those miracles. He had done them to people right in front of them, and they still didn't believe. So it's not one of those things. We find it hard to believe a lot of times when we think about it, but it's really, we've seen it before. He walked among them. He did the miracles right there in front of them, and they did not believe. They wanted more signs. They wanted him to show them more, give them some special revelation. Jesus had already been asked for a sign in Matthew 12:38, and in response, he had already pointed them to the sign of Jonah. Tradition held that a sign done on earth could be counterfeit from Satan, but signs done from heaven coming in or from the sky were assumed to be from God. R.T. France said the immediate demand of the Jewish leaders for a sign from heaven contrasts sharply with the Gentile crowd's response to Jesus's miracles. That's heavy if you think about it. You've got the religious people who doubt, the religious people who see it and go, yeah, it's pretty cool, but give me a better sign. And then you had the Gentiles who were in awe and fell down to worship in a lot of.
But he didn't represent the Gentiles' apple cart.
No, he didn't. He wasn't taking away their power and their wealth. So Matthew 15:31, the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. But instead of being in awe of the healing and the signs of Jesus, they questioned him. They asked for more. They wanted to know, if you're going to take away my power, I want to make sure you are who you say you are. They were hypocrites. You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the sign of the times. That's what he told them. Jesus condemned their hypocrisy. They felt confident about predicting the weather. They felt confident about all the other signs around them, but they were blind to the signs regarding Jesus's messianic credentials. The proof that they cannot discern the signs is that they asked for a sign. If they could see it and knew what the signs of Christ were, they never would have said, "Give me a sign." They would have seen it. Yes, ma'am.
But wouldn't you say this applies to us today?
Oh, yeah.
Scoffers that say, "Oh, Jesus said he's gonna come back 100 years ago."
Yeah.
But we should know the signs. We should be aware. We should be looking up. I mean, I take that the same. We say the signs of the times, not the signs of today. I mean, I think it was prophetic in the sense of talking about what we are seeing.
That's absolutely right. And that's one of the applications that we have when we're looking through this, and why I think it's important for us to have started in the beginning and go all the way through so that we can see those signs and that we don't fall prey to these people that are telling us, "I got a special revelation from God. And after these next 3 blood moons," and all these other things that they say, that we know we have the signs. He's given us all we need for what comes. And I also think it's important, we'll talk about it when we start hearing Jesus's words, that one of the things he says and stresses a lot is that you prepare. Just prepare for it. Don't necessarily sit around and wait for the exact time that it's going to happen, but prepare for it. So Jesus wasn't the only one to notice the hypocrisy in his day. The Jews of Jesus's day had a proverb that said, if all the hypocrites in the world were divided into 10 parts, Jerusalem would contain 9 of those 10 parts. So they knew it too. They knew there was hypocrisy everywhere. You cannot discern the signs of the times. And Jesus said this of the religious leaders of his own day regarding the signs of his first coming. They missed that. There were signs, there were prophecies. The Old Testament prophets had told them for centuries of the coming of Jesus, and they still didn't see it. They still didn't recognize he was who was supposed to be coming. The evidences that should have made it clear to them as signs of the times that the Messiah had come, many people today are just as blind to his coming and his future coming. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. This statement of Jesus reminds us that signs alone convert no one. It's easy to place far too much confidence in signs and wonders as tools to bring people to faith in Jesus. The problem isn't that the signs themselves are weak. They may be very strong signs of miraculous activity. But that the wicked and adulterous generation looks for those instead of looking toward the Messiah. They trust more in the signs. They look more for the signs instead of focusing on him. The Bible gives repeated examples of those who saw remarkable signs yet did not believe. He said, no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Jesus promised a sign that would have power to bring people to faith, his resurrection. He had previously mentioned the sign of the prophet Jonah earlier in Matthew 12, 39 through 41, clearly explaining his coming resurrection. Let's look at some of those comparisons between Jonah and Jesus. Jonah sacrificed himself that others would be saved. Remember when he was on the ship and the ship was being tossed and they thought we're all going to die? He said, I did it. It's all on me. Toss me overboard. So they did. As a result, Jonah disappeared from all human view in doing this. Jesus was not seen by humans before he was resurrected for that time that he was in the tomb. Jonah was sustained the days that he could not be seen. God provided all he needed while in the belly of the fish. Jonah came back after 3 days as back from the dead. Now, there's scholars who talk about Jonah being dead and then coming back to life or being alive in the fish. I think he was alive. I don't think he died and was resurrected. I think that the imagery is of him being spit out of that underwater grave, so to speak, as a resurrection, but I don't think he actually died in the fish. Jonah preached repentance. Now, if you remember Jonah's sermon, it was not very enthusiastic and there wasn't a whole lot to it, but he did preach what God told him to preach, which was repentance. And that's what he taught, and that's what Jesus taught. So those are some of those comparisons there. That was the sign he was saying. You know this. You know the signs that are given. You know the things that should happen. So you should be ready for that. That was just a short thing in Matthew 16 to talk about how we lead into what Jesus prophesied about end times. And that's going to really start in Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 41. It's a long passage, but if someone would start reading this and read through, well, just read till you're tired, and we'll get somebody else. So if somebody wants to read, we'll start here. Thank you.
Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another, but every one will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will all this happen? And what will be the sign of the coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his clothes. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out of the desert, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds from one end of the heavens to the other. And now somebody else.
All right, 32 through the rest of the chapter, if someone would read, please.
I'll finish it.
All right.
Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and he did not let his house be broken into.
You can stop there, Mike. That's good right there. Yeah, through 41. So what we're doing now is going through a portion of what we call the Olivet Discourse. It was a sermon that Jesus taught on the Mount of Olives. In verses 1 and 2, much like in Mark, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. Jesus would contend no more with the religious leaders at this point and never again come to the temple in his earthly ministry. This was his last time that he had been to the temple or was going to the temple. With emphasis, he went out and departed. F.F. Bruce said there is an emphasis on the idea of the verb. He was going away, like one who did not mean to return. They came to their master, going before in deeply preoccupied mood, and tried to change the gloomy current of his thoughts by inviting him to look back at the sacred structure. So as they came out, the disciples sensed Jesus was upset with what had happened inside and what he had seen there. And you know how we do when we have somebody that we know is visibly angry or upset or something else. I say, hey, look at this. They try to divert, right? And that's kind of what was happening here. The disciples were trying to divert a little bit. They showed him the temple and said, do you not see these things? In Mark, the disciples said, teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. The disciples seemed like tourists, kind of amazed at how beautiful it was. And if you've ever studied much about the temple, Solomon's temple was mighty grand. It was the temple of all temples. It was destroyed, then rebuilt, and then King Herod had done a lot of upgrades. We talked about, well, maybe we haven't yet. The temple was really big. We'll talk about it, I think. It was really beautiful. There were a lot of things done, and they seemed to be really interested. They seemed to be amazed. It was one of the most magnificent structures of the ancient world, and the Jewish people were justifiably proud of that temple. The temple was originally built or rebuilt by Zerubbabel and Ezra, if you read Ezra 6:15. But it was greatly expanded and improved by King Herod. It was the center of Jewish life for almost 1,000 years, so much so that it was customary for people to swear by the temple. They took it as a holy place, and they would, you know how people now, you'll hear them say, I swear on the Bible, I swear on my they'd swear on the temple. It was a holy place, and they would swear on it to make you know they were speaking truth or try to make you think it. After Herod's work, the temple was huge. It was nearly 500 yards long and 400 yards wide for a total of 1.8 million square feet. The place was huge. It was a huge complex. Now that includes the outer temple and the inner temple and all the different things there, but it was a huge structure that they were looking at. So it was something to be regarded as a wow moment when you saw it. That's what the disciples were pointing out. But the beauty of the ancient temple, although well documented, Jewish historian Josephus says that the temple was covered on the outside with gold plate. So not only was it big, it was ornate, it had a lot of things on it. They were so brilliant when the sun would shine on it that it was really blinding to look at. Where there wasn't gold, there were blocks of marble of such a pure white that from a distance, strangers thought it was snow on top of the temple. The comment of the disciples is especially appropriate given the massive stones Herod used in building the temple. Today, tourists can see some of those massive stones, at least the ones used to build the retaining wall around the temple compound. These quarried blocks of limestone are so big, some of them nearly 50 feet wide and 25 feet high and 50 feet deep. The size of this room, bigger than this room. Most modern construction cranes could not pick them up. They were that big. As great as the temple was, Jesus never hesitated to claim that he was greater than the temple. Look at Matthew 12:6. For many Jews of that day, the temple had become an idol. Just like we have our churches. We take the church building a lot of times and we put way more worth on the building than we should. Yes, it's precious to us. Yes, it's a great place for us to gather, but it's not something we should worship. The temple had become something that they were worshiping. So it was kind of taking on as equal to God or almost equal to God the importance in the Jewish life. Josephus the Jew in Antiquities 15:14 says, tell us that for 8 whole years, it tells us that for 8 whole years, Herod kept 10,000 men at work around it every day. And that for magnificence and stateliness, it exceeded Solomon's temple. Bigger, looked more ornate. The disciples wanted Jesus to look at the beautiful buildings, but he told them to turn around and take a good look at those things. These things, not building, implying indifference to the splendors admired by the disciples. Not one stone shall be left here upon another. As we read in Mark as well, some 40 years after Jesus said this, there was a widespread Jewish revolution against the Romans in Palestine. And they enjoyed many early successes, but ultimately Roman soldiers crushed all the rebels. And in AD 70, Jerusalem was completely leveled, including the temple, just as Jesus had said it would happen. That shall not be thrown down. This prophecy was literally fulfilled. There was a real temple, and it was really destroyed. The literal fulfillment of this prophecy establishes the tone for the rest of the prophecies in the chapter, and we should expect a literal fulfillment of those as well. We may also observe how little God values splendid houses of prayer when they are made dens of thieves. And that's something I think we really should take care to keep in our mind as we gather together, as we look together. We need facilities that can accommodate us and let us do the things that we need to do, but we should never get to the point where that's our main focus.
It makes you wonder if the building was gone and we had to stand out in the hot sun. Would we come? Would we like to?
I think it was David Platt said one time, he said, if we took all the cushions off the pews, took out all the air conditioning, turned off all the lights, we turned the speakers off, turned everything else off, would you still be here? And, unfortunately, I think a lot of people, I ain't going in there, it's too hot.
Well, we've seen that with online church in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that, we do put more in it than we should. And we need to be careful because God does not care about what this building has, what it can do, how many air conditioners, how many heaters, how many anything we have. He cares about what we're doing in our fellowship to him. That's the point of that Jesus was making, is this temple means nothing. It's nothing. In verse 3, as in Mark, we see that Jesus' prediction brings up two questions from the disciples. So as he sat on the Mount of Olives, removed from the temple, he's still overlooking it there on the mount. The disciples asked Jesus questions about his bold prediction concerning the destruction, because they were looking at it and going, one, why would they do it? And then two, how? But they said, when will these things be? Jesus said the temple would be completely destroyed, and it was logical that the disciples wanted to know when. They're like, okay, well, it's going to be done, but when? Jesus will speak to the question, but only in the context of answering their next two questions that they had. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The disciples probably thought they asked only one question. In their mind, it was just one question around the destruction of the temple and then the end of the age. But really, they asked those two questions, and some say three, and the second question is answered in the remainder of the chapter. It's a bit ironic to me, though, that Jesus had just rebuked the Pharisees and the Sadducees for asking about the signs. But yet, here's his disciples, the ones that have been walking with him, that are saying, what's the signs? You told us all that, but how will we know? Now, the signs that they were asking for were a bit different, but still, it's a bit ironic that they were asking for those signs as well. Now, the disciples didn't, count them up and say, hey, we got a few questions we want to ask you. They were just kind of generally curious. But in all probability, they really were a bit confused. Jesus's answer was directed mainly for them to kind of get their apprehension about what was going to happen, to give them some answer there. It may also be that in the second question, as it was asked, as they remember the events surrounding the first temple's destruction because Solomon's temple was destroyed in the context of national judgment and exile. Remember back when all the Jews were taken out, the temple was destroyed, and they're trying to figure out, we know this happened in the past, and it was because the nation was disobedient, didn't do what you said. So how does this play together? And as Jesus answers this important second question, he'll make many specific comments and predictions about the end times. These predictions have been the source of significant disagreement among Christians who have tried to understand what he's saying. Why didn't Jesus simply say it so clearly that there was no possibility anyone could ever misunderstand him? Well, one reason why prophecy may seem vague or imprecise is because God wants every age to have reasons to be ready for Jesus's return. If Jesus gave the entire answer for everything so specifically, we know the date and the time and all of the exact events, what are we going to do?
But Jesus didn't even know.
I know. He didn't know.
Right, so he couldn't really tell him.
Yeah. He couldn't because he didn't know.
Right.
But if we knew, if he did, and he wrote it all down, God's providence and the way he reveals and the way he has revealed gives specific stages of how we've gone through and how we've learned things and how we've grown. And if we just knew he's coming on January the 15th at 12 p.m., I'm going to live like a sinner. I'm going to do all the things I can. I'm going to go, in 10. Nah, Lord. That's what he was trying. He wants everybody to be ready at any time. Be prepared. Do the things that I've commanded. Don't live that way up to the very last moment and think you can get it right in under the wire. Be ready. That's why I said a while ago, part of the message that Jesus gives is about being ready at all times. So God wants every age to have reasons to be ready for his return. We should not think of Jesus' return as an event far off on a timeline, but something we have been running parallel with since the day of Pentecost. So we should be thinking just like the disciples thought when their time. They thought he was going to come in their lifetime. We should think he's coming tomorrow. I don't know when exactly, but be ready. Others suggest that God's intention was to keep the future somewhat vague and clouded to confound the devil, even as the resurrection of the Messiah was vague in the Old Testament. I don't really think that's the case. I think he's confounded anyway. He thinks he's smarter than he is, but I don't think he did it just to confound the devil. Though some prophetic interpretations are different, we are sure of this. He is coming again, and we should be ready. We must be ready. We'll stop there, and we'll start next week in verses 4 through 8, and we'll continue to work through. We'll work through what he says and why he says it, preparing them for what ultimately I think in the end of this chapter is some of the most important parts of his end time prophecies that he'll say. But we'll take a little break in there and kind of talk about the different views so that we understand what one commentator told me the other day. The secret, or what I read the other day, is the secret decoder ring, so you can understand how the different people view end time prophecies. They have this view that they lay on top of it. And if you subscribe to those, you'll get one take out of it. And if you subscribe to others, you'll get a different take out of it. But we'll cover those a bit later. All right. Comments or questions? All right. Thank y'all very much. Ed, you close us this morning?